Hey everybody, here's another great guest that we had on the Fringe radio show. For more information on the show and other guests, go to www.thefringeradioshow.com. Enjoy.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for being here tonight on a Saturday night and giving up a little bit of your time to spend with us.
My pleasure.
Hopefully the weather there is a little better than it is here, Charles. We're getting ready for another snowstorm again.
You know, it warmed up here. I'm outside of D.C., but it's rainy and drizzly and dreary now. So
I know.
It might be better if it started snowing again.
Yeah. Well, and I'm sure you experienced that Arctic blast that hit the Midwest and the stuff that went up the East Coast, just crazy. Anyway, I've read about a lot of your work. We had a lot of listeners that sent in a lot of great questions, which I'd love to talk to you about some different subjects. But how did you get into working for the CIA? What kind of led up to that for you? Was it a desire to get in the military at a young age? How did it all come together for you?
Actually, I was in the Army. I was an officer in the United States Army. I was a combat arms officer and a JAG officer for a while. I had gotten out of the Army. It was a combination of things. It was a healthy dose of wanderlust, of wanting to be out moving around, of feeling like that there were things going on and adventures to be had. It was an intense interest in national security. Just overall a feeling that I had gotten out of the Army. I was actually practicing law, and I just sort of had this idea that I don't want to make the same 12-minute commute to work every day and be handling the same case 25 years from now, just with different names as I'm handling today. So I took the leap.
Yeah. And obviously a very exciting career and kind of a for the average citizen out there, kind of scary. I mean, the things that you do and the things that you dig into and what you've been a part of.
When you're functioning as an operations officer, otherwise known as a case officer for the CIA, which is what the average layperson calls a CIA agent, but the CIA doesn't use that term in that way anyway. When you're on the street and you're abroad and you're running operations and handling sources, it's fantastic. I mean, on a good day, it's the best job you could possibly imagine because it can be exciting. It is, and it's often very, very important stuff, and you really are making a contribution. On a bad day when you're dealing with the bureaucracy coming out of Washington, D.C., you may be about to hand in your resignation papers. But on a good day, it's good stuff.
Well, and knowing that you're keeping things in check and protecting people, you're making sure that things don't get too out of control.
Yeah, people obviously have a variety of different feelings about the whole business of espionage and spying. There's a little bit of tension between the concept of American liberty and the whole idea of a spy organization, which I personally think is very healthy. I think we ought to retain that tension. But regardless of how you feel about that, I mean, the guys and ladies that are out there really on the cutting edge collecting this kind of intelligence are doing some incredibly valuable, incredibly powerful things. I mean, these are folks who are not only ensuring that we'll win a war, but more often than people realize, preventing a war from ever happening, preventing a crisis from ever occurring. And when you can be on the ground floor of that, it's very, very satisfying.
Well, after 9/11, which I think was probably the biggest wake-up call to the world, especially to the American people, obviously a lot of things were put in motion after that. Security tightened up. I mean, we're still seeing the after effects of it as far as, trying to travel anywhere. Obviously, Homeland Security has stepped in. Of course, there's probably some people that that believe that some of the government groups, whoever they may be overstepping their bounds a little bit. But obviously a major change, and a major change for the whole world, because of September 11th, and obviously, the whole, with you move, I would assume that the move into Iran, when you took the team into Iran, was, 9/11 was probably the driving force. It was the catalyst.
Right, you're talking about Iraq.
Iraq. I'm sorry, Iraq.
Iraq in 2002. There may be a team in Iran, but we can't talk about that.
Okay.
So that's a whole other deal. Yeah, I mean, I worked counterterrorism virtually from the first day that I came out of training. So for those of us that had been involved in counterterrorism for some time, 9/11 was in many ways not a surprise. I don't mean to say that we knew of the specific attack or that it wasn't a horrible event. I just mean that for those of us who were doing that work, we were well aware that we had been at war for some time, and effectively our government had just decided we weren't going to shoot back. There was a great deal of frustration in counterterrorist circles preceding 9/11. But since then, you're right. I mean, the country is now well aware that the threat is there. There really are people and groups out there that are out to get us. I'm always telling people, that doesn't mean we have to be hysterical.
Right.
And that doesn't mean that every security measure that everybody comes up with is justified, or that we need to sacrifice every civil liberty. Basically the way I put it is, in between complacency and hysteria, there is a prudent level of vigilance and, just being alert and taking reasonable measures and not going to sleep again. And that's where we need to be.
Well, and it seemed right after 9/11, obviously, everything went kind of crazy, and the panic was there. And then of course there's all the, doing the kind of show we do, Charles. We decided in 2014 to bring more science-based people like yourself that, were in the field. I mean, there's the conspiracy theorist. I've heard so many different, I've had so many different interviews with so many different people and heard so many different stories. Everything from, a holographic airplane to laser beams to aliens, destroying the. I mean, and I'm sure you've read and heard the same things. But I agree with you. It seemed like the world, or at least America, was in mass panic. But there's a couple things kind of up again on the board that and I'd like to get your take on it. We had a bunch of listeners actually email questions in on this. Of course, the NSA right now, it just seems that in general people feel that every email they write, every phone call they make, every text message that they send is being scrutinized, and it seems like right now that is probably one of the big hot buttons. What is maybe your take, or what can you tell people when they ask those type of questions?
I think when we talk about NSA and the entire issue of what NSA is doing and civil liberties, that there are a number of different facets. So, in no particular order. First, I think it's important for people to understand that whether you think NSA should be doing these things or should not be doing these things, there is virtually no evidence of any sort of widespread illegality on the part of NSA. So I'm not writing a blank check to claim that everybody that works at NSA has never done anything wrong or nobody's ever abused their authority. That in a government this size, that would be silly. But what I'm saying is that NSA is doing what they have been told to do by the government, and frankly, by and large, with the full knowledge of our elected officials. So, the first thing for people to understand is that this is not one of these cases where we point to somebody and say, my God, you've gone rogue, and who told you to do this, and why are you off doing these things? They're doing it because they've been told to do it. That doesn't answer the question of whether they should. I think NSA's capabilities, electronic capabilities, intercept capabilities, are very, very, very important. I do not believe that the dragnet approach to simply sucking up every electron on the planet and feeding it into a supercomputer and trying to catch terrorists that way is effective. I don't think, and I think the lack of evidence that the government has been able to produce to document that effectiveness shows that pretty graphically, that this is another case of Washington doing something because they can. In other words, using those SIGINT capabilities in a targeted way in combination with other capabilities is one thing. Just, sweeping up all of the electronic data on the planet, frankly, doesn't really get us anywhere.
Right.
On the civil liberties issue, frankly, also, I think it's several steps too far. I don't think they should be doing it. I don't think we ought to be accepting it. I don't think it's necessary, and I don't think it's appropriate under the Fourth Amendment. And I think, but that's not a question of them doing it of illegality in the sense that they've gone off on their own. That's a question of the Congress and the President ought to tell them to knock it off and take a couple of steps back. And, of course, part of the reason Washington doesn't do that is because that then implies responsibility. When you're the President and the Congress and you tell them not to do it, then you are doing what a leader does, which is you're taking responsibility for the consequences, meaning that if and when there's an attack, you're prepared to answer the questions. Politicians often treat intelligence agencies, blaming intelligence agencies as a convenient way to avoid responsibility themselves.
Well, and I think, too, in all fairness, we talk about everybody, of course, has a different opinion on things, and I respect everybody's opinion on the NSA, but they're even in the public. I mean, people worry. They sometimes get a little bit too worried, I think, about what the NSA is doing. But look at here the Target stores data breach. Now it's coming out that it wasn't just a handful of people. They're figuring over 70 million records, 70 million cards were compromised with all kinds of different information, and that's in the public sector. So it just goes to show you that, I mean, you have to be we have to be a little bit careful as as consumers. In the case of the Target data breach, there's a lot of things out there that can get you, if you will.
Yeah, but there's nothing you could do about the Target.
That's right.
I mean, there's nothing.
Well, no, there isn't. But I'm saying that. But a lot of people's accounts are potentially compromised. And again, I think with the NSA, I know people have a lot of concerns, but also on the other side, if not necessarily with digging into everybody's email, I like you said, Charles, I'm sure if they pulled every ounce of data, they're what's it going to do? It's just going to be a big conglomerate, just a big mess. But if there is the potential to intercept terrorist organization information or these terror cells, or and I'm by no means an expert in this like you are, if there's a way to raise some red flags and potentially stop something bad, well, I think that I'm all for it.
Well, again, this does become at some point kind of a technical subject and a very difficult subject sometimes to talk about in an unclassified setting, like a radio show. But when I talk about a dragnet approach, I mean, we're not talking about a question of whether the NSA should have the capability to intercept all sorts of communications. There's a fundamental difference, though, between the fact that we have some information suggesting that an address or a company or particular individuals are involved in wrongdoing, and then targeting those individuals and those folks associated with them for collection. One thing, and I think most people would have no issue with that, with appropriate, procedures. The other side of it is what we're talking about with NSA now, which is sort of scooping up everybody's communications. We're not really talking about the content of the communications, but a tremendous amount of the data associated with it, and then hoping that somehow you have the processing capacity to crunch all of that, and that's going to take you to the bad guys. And all I can tell you is that in my experience, of decades of being a guy on the street whose job it was to work to work against terrorists, which means in some cases working with them in the sense of recruiting some of them to work for us and hunting them and tracking them down. I've never been involved with or heard of a case where we didn't have any other information and some supercomputer told us to go look in some place. It doesn't work like that. I mean, it may work like that in the movies, but in the real world it works a lot, much more old-fashioned shoe leather kind of way,
right,
where through a combination of things you get focused on something. So I guess what I'm saying is that not only is there the civil liberties issue, but that the argument that somehow we will all die if we don't do this, I think is spurious. That's not true.
Gotcha. Very good. Another question that was sent in for you is, Charles, what are your thoughts about the state of our security today? Who poses the largest threat and by what means?
Well, if we're talking about terrorism in that context, the day that we started shooting back, in other words, September 12th of 2001, the world fundamentally changed for terrorists, because prior to that time, it was effectively impossible to get approval for types of operations that are run routinely now. I know that because I proposed many, and many other officers did, and we were not willing to essentially shoot back, as I put it before. So as soon as we turned that corner, the world changed in a very dramatic way for anybody who's trying to target the United States. I mean, the life expectancy of a chief of operations for Al-Qaeda now is about 6 months from the time he takes the job. That's about whatever he's going to get done, he better get done in 6 months, because he's probably going to be dead after 6 months. So it's a dramatically different world, but this war is going to go on, this struggle is going to go on for a long time, and it's going to continue to evolve and continue to morph. Big issues now, American citizens that have been radicalized. That we have American citizens going abroad and acting as suicide bombers, American citizens that are wrapped up here. So while we're focused on people getting into the country, we need to be focused on the fact that they may already be here. The whole weapons of mass destruction threat, chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons, people kind of think of it, I think, as science fiction. It's not, particularly biological weapons. Really, really, really terrifying. I mean, huge. That's a weapon that, done right, using it right in a very antiseptic way, done right can kill millions of people, and the science is not all that hard.
And pretty horribly, too, I would assume.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, every weapon, every weapons of mass destruction expert that I know who focuses on the terrorist threat will tell you that a terrorist biological attack is the single most likely, most worrisome true weapons of mass destruction event that they're focused on. The Weapons of Mass Destruction Commission in the United States predicted in 2008 that we would have a biological terror attack on U.S. soil within 5 years. So we made it out of 2013 without that coming true, but that will give you an idea of the immediacy of it when you have a U.S. government commission whose official finding was, we expect to see this on our soil within 5 years.
Scary stuff. Mm-hmm. Scary stuff and needs immediate attention, like you said. Another question for you, Charles, if I can throw some at you. It said, can Charles comment on the involvement of mercenary companies like Blackwater in the war?
I assume we're talking about Iraq and Afghanistan
yes.
The overall war on terror. I think that there are a lot of good reasons why the U.S. government and the intelligence community employs contractors of various types these days, and in some cases it makes a lot of sense, saves people money. I do a lot of contracting still for the U.S. government because, it's a way for the U.S. government to leverage expertise that I have accumulated over the course of decades. when they're doing that kind of thing, I think it makes sense. When they're outsourcing core functions, particularly combat functions, I think we've crossed another one of those lines we shouldn't cross. For a variety of reasons, but here's the most fundamental one, because the whole idea is that when the United States goes to war, it is supposed to be a decision made by the citizenry of the United States. We're supposed to have a say in this, and this is the way the Constitution is drafted, that, why the power to declare war is reserved to Congress and so forth. This is supposed to be a discussion where the group makes a judgment that this is so important that we're really going to commit ourselves to armed conflict. And when you start talking about employing contract entities like this, what you're doing is opting completely out of that process. I mean, the executive branch is effectively just buying people to go do this job. It doesn't change the fact that as far as the people on the ground in Iraq or Afghanistan are concerned, we are at war with them. I mean, it might not be your son or daughter fighting, but this country is in that conflict now.
Very interesting. Another question is, Charles, could you talk a little bit? If Charles could talk a little bit about the Iran treaty over its nuclear program, do you feel that Iran can be trusted to comply?
Yes, so I can give you really short. In contrast to my usual long-winded answers,
okay.
I give you a really short one for that. The answer would be no.
Cannot.
No, this is crazy. I'm sorry to laugh about something that is so serious, but look, the Iranians have pursued a nuclear weapon for a long time, and they keep saying that they are pursuing enrichment, for instance, where a process that you put uranium through to make it usable in a weapon or in a reactor, that they're pursuing this for peaceful purposes. Well, I'm not a nuclear physicist, but I've worked weapons of mass destruction for a long time, and I know enough about physics to know that none of that explains a number of the things that they have done. In other words, it is transparently obvious to anybody who is actually looking at the level of enrichment and other things that they've done that the only utility of any of these efforts is to build a bomb. In fact, they have enriched fuel to a level. You put it through this process of enrichment and they have enriched it to a level where it is actually no longer usable in a reactor. And the only reason you would enrich it to that level is as a step toward putting it in a bomb, and then denied that it's for a bomb. So at some point it just becomes ridiculous. No, what the Iranians are doing with the treaty is exactly what the Iranians always do. We impose sanctions that finally began to bite. They finally began to hurt them. They finally began to have consequences. So they came to the negotiating table, and now what they're effectively doing is playing for time. And they want us to begin to relax the sanctions, and then they want us to begin to stray and not pay attention anymore, and to turn around in 5 years and find that they finally assembled the thing. That's the entire calculus, and apparently we are falling for that, I guess. I don't understand the idea of imposing sanctions to make someone change their behavior, and then as soon as they begin to bite and the person actually begins to change their behavior, then backing them off. That seems to me to be contrary to every negotiating technique that any person with common sense would employ in any setting, but that's exactly what we're doing.
Well, I'm going to plead ignorance on this. As far as their nuclear capability, and you could tell me if I'm right or wrong, I would assume that if they're trying to build a nuclear weapon, obviously they're not building a fleet of items or the type of material, the type of weaponry that we have or Russia has. I would assume it's small-scale stuff, but obviously could do a ton of damage. I would assume that, and I could be wrong on this too, and you could correct me, I would assume it's something that most likely could not make it into the United States, but I don't know. What do you feel if they were to put a weapon of this type together, they would use it locally, in the surrounding countries around them, or do you think they would try to initiate some sort of a a launch onto American soil?
Well, if we're talking about any time in the near future, 5, 10 years at least, there is no chance that the Iranians are going to have a weapon that they're going to be able to fire on a missile that's going to hit U.S. soil. I can't. They don't have that capability. They do not have such a missile. They don't have any prospect of developing such a missile. So they're not going to fire an ICBM at U.S. soil.
Okay.
Now, I can't preclude every possible scenario that they could find some other way to get one into the United States, but that's not really what people's primary concern is. They will have a weapon that they can put on this missile they call the Shahab 3, which can hit Israel and all of the other surrounding nations in the Middle East. And in addition to the hostility, obviously, between the Iranians and the Israelis, some other things to keep in mind here. First of all, the Israelis have no strategic depth, by which I mean Israel is a postage stamp-sized country. Israelis are great people. They've done amazing things there. It's a tiny little country. A relative handful of nuclear weapons detonated over Tel Aviv and the surrounding area could effectively kill the state of Israel. I mean, not just in terms of immediate casualties, but in terms of irradiating it and all the resulting damage that you could affect. So this is one of the things that's obviously on the Israelis' mind. We don't, back in the day, the horrible days of mutual assured destruction between us and the Soviet Union, we would contemplate things like losing Chicago and New York City and then somehow continuing to fight. Okay, well, that's crazy, but the fact is, in a country of hundreds of millions of people, 3,000 miles across, you can think about that kind of thing. The Israelis could literally, one salvo of nuclear weapons could effectively end the state of Israel. The other thing is that there are other nations in the Middle East that are hostile to the Iranians beyond the Israelis. The Iranians are Persians, and they are Shia Muslims, and they and certainly all Sunni Muslim Arabs hate each other, the Saudis first and foremost. So if the Iranians get a nuclear weapon, the first thing the Saudis will do is go buy themselves a stack of nuclear weapons from the Pakistanis, who have more than enough. They won't bother to develop them. They will just, since they've got stacks of money, they'll just pay billions of dollars and buy an arsenal and go from not being a nuclear power to having nuclear weapons. So what you have an incredibly unstable place that's is always on the verge of falling apart and is always filled with conflict. And if you take this to a nuclear level, you're not going to have this stable relationship that we had with the Soviet Union. I don't mean to make that sound idyllic, but those were two predictable entities, the Soviet Union and the United States. This is the Middle East. I mean, if you take it to this level, people will use these weapons. That's what will happen. Countries will, in fact, get nuked.
And would definitely put a lot of things into. I mean, it would. I guess depends who backs who, but truly probably would be the beginning of another world war.
Who knows what direction it goes.
Right.
And people talk all the time about the Israelis. I mean, the fact that the Israelis will not let the Iranians get a nuclear weapon. Well, I have all the utmost respect for the Israelis. I've worked alongside Israeli services in the field. They're tough guys, tough ladies, and they do what they have to do to keep Israel in existence. They don't have the United States Air Force. They do not have a mid-air refueling capability. They do not have heavy bombers. All of the spirit in the world does not change that, which is my way of saying they do not necessarily have the capacity to take out an Iranian nuclear program.
Right.
To bomb Iran and hit a target is one thing. To take out the program, particularly when it's been moved into bunkers and so forth, is another. It's not easy, and they do not necessarily have the capacity to do that on their own.
Very good. Thank you for your insight on that. Another question that came in for you, Charles, and this is kind of seems to be this issue goes hot and cold, but obviously has been hot for a little bit. Question is, does Charles think that drones should be expanded for local authorities to use?
I don't have any problem with the idea per se of drones being used by local authorities. In other words, I don't think that there needs to be a black and white line that prevents that from happening. I do think we ought to think about it long and hard, and I do think, as with a lot of subjects, that we ought to let states and local jurisdictions make a lot of these judgments instead of the federal government imposing a one-size-fits-all solution for everything in the country. Because there are clearly privacy concerns, there are also safety concerns. I, like everybody else, watched this business with Amazon talking about delivering packages via drones, and I'm just really wondering. I live on a fairly decent-sized piece of property with a fair amount of space around it, but I'm still wondering what happens when my dog is out in the yard when the drone tries to land, or if somebody's kids are playing when this thing sets down. So I'm not opposed to it per se. I just think we ought to be careful.
Be careful with
those.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, it was kind of funny. I could imagine just hundreds of those, and heard a press conference after the videos were released of the CEO of Amazon, and to them it wasn't an advertising stunt. Maybe that was the whole point of it underlying, but they want to press on with a service like that. Boy, talk about having to rewrite everything, the FAA and everything imaginable with these little modules, these little quadcopters buzzing all over would be craziness.
You know, drones, I can tell you this from personal experience, from having retrieved a number of them on the ground. Drones crash. They fall out of the sky, even really expensive ones that people spend a lot of time building and that are used for very sophisticated purposes don't come home sometimes.
Right.
So God knows how many of these quadcopters of Amazons are going to end up on your roof.
Or hit somebody.
Yeah, it's crazy.
It's going to be crazy.
Yeah.
Come down on you in traffic.
Your group, Orion Strategic Services, can you talk a little bit about that? Do you lecture on all these different topics? What does your organization do? If you can talk about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, in typical fashion, when I retired, I'm always have more balls in the air than I can probably juggle at any one point in time. So I teach college, I teach graduate school, I write fiction, nonfiction, I write, as you said, online, and I do contracting, consulting. It is I do it for private industry, I do it for the government. It's effectively providing subject matter expertise. In other words, my expertise and that of a small group of individuals that work with me, who are all basically veterans of either special operations or the intelligence community working for the U.S. government. And it's been an eclectic mix. A lot of it basically boils down to training programs, sometimes formal classroom, a lot of it's street work. And as I said, we do it for private industry. We do it for the government. I'd love to expand, actually, what we do for private industry. At the end of the day, a huge amount of it is for the U.S. government, and that's clearly, for me right now, the biggest moneymaker. I'd love to change that calculus. But in other words, I take people out who are getting ready to go downrange and do what I did for 20 years, and we teach them how to do it. And part of that is hard trade school kind of skills, if that makes any sense.
Yes.
Related to surveillance and things like that. And a lot of it is psychology, to be honest with you, because a lot of espionage is psychology. It's, the idea is not to win a gunfight in the street. The idea is to conduct your operation in a way that the gunfight in the street never occurs.
Right.
And, and that you never draw your weapon, and that you think 3 steps ahead of your opponent. That's the way you run real operations.
Very good. Another question that came in for you, Charles, it said, what are your thoughts on nefarious desires of the Chinese government? Should we be afraid?
Well, I don't like the word afraid. So that was my hang-up. That was what that pregnant pause was all about.
Okay.
I'm not afraid of the Chinese, but I think there are a number of we live in a dangerous world, and we ought to be alert to that and recognize that there are threats out there and be prepared to deal with them. The Chinese government remains a communist nation. It is not a democratic state, and it is increasingly aggressive, particularly in regard to raw materials, because they are eating up all their own raw materials at a fantastic rate. And we need to recognize that. So folks that have watched the news are aware that the Chinese and the Japanese have been butting heads over particular airspace off the east coast of China for some time now. The Chinese are also butting heads with the Filipinos over offshore areas down near the Philippines. All of that is about oil. All of that is about areas in the ocean where people believe there are huge oil deposits, and the Chinese want to claim them because they intend to use that oil because they are exhausting all their other sources of energy. So, I mean, we're not really friends with them. We may be buying a lot of stuff from them, but we are not friends with their government, and there are a lot of reasons why we could end up with conflict with them. So we ought to just be prepared for that.
Yeah. Well, and I think the idiot with the earrings in his lips and that needs to. I'm so sick of Rodman being on television.
I was thinking the other day that actually, is he still there?
Oh, yeah, he was singing Happy Birthday last night.
Yeah, I think, well, so this would be a good time, I think, if we could figure out how to take away his citizenship.
Yes.
Then he couldn't get back, and then I think we would be in good shape. I don't, obviously don't know Dennis Rodman personally, and I presume on some level that he has somehow convinced himself that he's doing something great. But, all kidding aside, the North Korean regime makes communist China look like a paradise. It is a complete psycho wasteland, and where there are huge slave labor camps, and people are abused in ways that are unspeakable every day. And for him to be clowning around with the leader of this country and joking with him while people are being abused and tortured and enslaved every day, I think is, at a certain point it isn't funny.
Yeah, it's sickening is what it is.
It's kind of sick and sad.
Yeah, it is. Well, and the leadership there, Charles, those people rule so heavily on emotion. Again, I don't profess to be an expert on any of it. I read the news like every other American does, and you kind of get a little gist of things. But those countries, the leadership is very emotional people that make very emotional decisions very hastily and quickly, with not a lot of thought behind it in some cases.
Well, you're talking about folks that are so isolated and so separated from what we consider to be reality.
Right, exactly.
That they are often making decisions that in the real world are very irrational. But they also often do things that appear to us to be completely irrational that are in fact very calculating. North Korea is a failed state. It's a disaster. Other than having this large 1950s vintage military, it's an abject failure. It can't feed its own people. It can't do anything. And what they have fallen into is a pattern of behavior for a number of years now, where they basically throw a tantrum and fire a missile and test a nuke and threaten to do ever more egregious things. And we reward them by ultimately ending up at a negotiating table, and then in exchange for them not doing it anymore, we give them some sort of aid, food aid or energy assistance or other things. So, anybody who's ever raised a kid understands that if every time your child throws a fit, you reward them by giving them something, that behavior is not going to end. All you're doing is teaching them that that's how they get what they want. And we have done that with the North Koreans for a long time. Tell them that every time the domestic pressure gets too high and the famine is too widespread, that they need to fire a couple of missiles and threaten to nuke Japan, and the West will come and bail them out. I think what they need is, we need to be vigilant in the sense that if they do something that is so crazy that it has to be responded to, then we obviously have to be prepared to defend ourselves. And other than that, Let them face the consequences of the choices they've made.
Exactly.
Don't bail them out.
Exactly. Need to stick to our guns a little bit more than we have been. Looking through your books, Charles, you got a lot of books out. Willful Neglect: The Dangerous Illusions of Homeland Security, Beyond Repair, Codename Aphrodite. You got a lot of. Do you have some new books in the works? I looked at some of the headlines, some of the just the quick blurbs on them. Barbosa seems to be a very, very interesting book. Do you have other stuff that you're working on?
I wrote 3 works of nonfiction: Beyond Repair, Willful Neglect, and a book called Operation Hotel California, which are all talking about the intelligence community and the Homeland Security apparatus. And then the other 3 are all novels that are all a series sort of built around the same 2 characters, Codename Aphrodite and Barbarossa. And the most recent book is a book called Kaffa, which is the 3rd in that series. And, what I try to do with all of the fiction I write is this. First of all, I try to make it fun to read. So so it's not supposed to be a textbook and it's not supposed to be a chore. Something that you pick up and you turn the pages and it's a fast read and it's something that you're having fun. The other thing I try to do is give a little bit of a real flavor of what counterterrorism operations are really like, which is not a lot about flying cars and wristwatches with, all kinds of cool gadgets in them, but, it's kind of gritty and dangerous, and it's about living by your wits. But I also try to weave in some things about threats. So we were talking about, likely threats before. The latest one, Kaffa, it's built around a hypothetical biological weapons attack on the United States that takes place on the East Coast and trying to stop it as it's already underway. And I'm already working on an outline for a 4th book, which I think will probably be set in India and focus on a attempt to melt down a nuclear power plant.
Oh, interesting. Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Well, your writings keep between your company and all the work you do and interviewing and writing books. It doesn't seem like retirement at all.
No, I'm definitely not the smartest guy. Obviously, I should have. You're supposed to retire, I think, and play golf or something like that. So, I retired and immediately took on like 4 jobs, I think, and I typically get done. I'm out on the street doing training or something, and come in and then immediately go into my office and start writing or doing interviews or whatever. I like to be busy. I don't really do well sitting around twiddling my thumbs.
Keeps us all young at heart. We've got a couple minutes left, but I had a couple more questions for you. Before I get to the questions, where can our listeners get your books from? Where can they purchase those?
The easiest place to find my books is just go on Amazon.
Okay.
All of my stuff is available there. The easiest place to find me on the web is if you go to And Magazine, I actually have, which is on the web, andmagazine.com, and you will find sort of my section of And Magazine, which is called the United States of Common Sense. And that's all my articles and all my interviews and also links to every place else I am out on the web, my company and everything from there.
Okay, very good. So people can go out there and pick up your books there through Amazon or through your website, or link through your website. One couple last questions for you, and again, we'll let you get back to your Saturday night. It said, Charles, could all the intelligence agencies be merged, and would that create a better functioning system with better communications?
Could they? Yeah, they could. Do I think it would be an improvement? No. Look, I think that the reality is that in the national defense, homeland security, and intelligence realms, we are suffering currently from the same ills we suffer from on the domestic side of the federal government, which is to say too much bureaucracy, too many layers of middle management. You got the same 6 guys in Yemen, but we got 500 more guys sending them messages now.
Right.
What we don't need is more cumbersome organization. The whole federal government needs to be leaner, flatter, more effective. So we don't need any more layers of reorganization.
A little bit of simpler, a little more simpler wouldn't hurt. Another question, and the last question for you. It said, Charles, if you were the head of the CIA, what changes would you make?
I would make changes exactly along the lines of what I just said, which is I would reduce the size of headquarters, reduce the size of the bureaucracy, reduce the number of redundant layers of folks that are typically holding things up. I mean, intelligence work, particularly CIA, human source stuff, is an art, not a science. You need the right people, and then they need to be free to move really fast and really creatively. I'm not talking about breaking U.S. law or violating people's rights. I just mean you need them to be able to push the envelope and move really, really fast. And you can't do that in a standard bureaucratic model. You don't have time for somebody to staff things and prepare a PowerPoint presentation. You need to go.
Very good. Charles, I want to thank you for being here tonight and giving us some of your time on your weekend. It was an honor to talk with you and hear you talk.
Yes, thank you so much.
And I wish you the best in 2014. And again, thank you for giving us some time.
Super. Thank you guys for having me. It was fun.
Okay.
You take care and have a wonderful
Have a great
night.
weekend, Charles. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Good night.